It's preparing. All right, and we are live. So, welcome everyone. Walter McKenzie with the Worthy Educator, our second April town hall. And tonight we're focusing on NAEP, a very important instructional topic, and looking forward to the conversation. Before we get started, I want to remind you that our town halls are a safe place for educators to come together. We stay nonpartisan, we stay away from conspiracy theories, and we do not get alarmist. We deal in the facts and we build constructive strategies. That's what we're all about. For those of you that are new, we will not publish, share, or mention you by name or any other identifiable information as you use your voice. So please know when we say this is a safe place, you are safe with us. With us tonight, we have two wonderful uh, instructional champions in education. Samantha Shane, a CTE teacher, a worthy educator leader, and a contributing author to our winter journal. Samantha, welcome, representing New Jersey.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to talk tonight.
And Shantae Garrett, the CEO of our Empowering Learners and Leaders to Excel, a former superintendent and chief academic officer, hailing from North Carolina. Shantae, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with everyone tonight.
Honored to have you. So our town halls are a component of the EDInfluencers program. And if you go to the Worthy Educator, you'll see EDInfluencers right at the top of the site menu. And there are specific things we encourage people to do as professional educators. One, attend your school board meetings. Do letter writing and calling. Hold your own town halls locally with other like-minded educators and stakeholders, and even conduct online social media campaigns. And when you go to the EdInfluencers page, you'll see that we have a complete media kit there. So if you want to post some things on Facebook, LinkedIn, the platform of your choice, you don't have to create things from scratch. There's a lot of good video, graphics, messaging that you can use just to get the word out that you support public education and what's best for kids. So that having been said, the National Assessment of Educational Progress was established in 1964 with a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the first national assessments were conducted in 1969. In '88, Congress passed legislation authorizing voluntary trial state assessments, and by '96, these assessments were made a permanent feature of NAEP. It's administered every 2 years, and starting in 2001, states were required to participate in fourth and eighth grade reading and math as a condition for receiving federal aid. So here we are. We just had the assessments in 2024, and the data is available now. And so we thought this was a great time to debrief and then talk about how to think about moving forward, preparing for the next NAEP assessments in January 2026. So, Samantha, your perspective from New Jersey.
So, I don't know why I find like NAEP in itself just so interesting because I'm a high school teacher and it's for fourth and eighth graders. My students are obviously not taking it, but
Yeah,
the data, we talk a lot in my class because my students all want to become educators. So we talk a lot about what it means and what it means for instruction. And
right,
I'm getting these students who were once in fourth and eighth grade, right?
right.
So the reading and writing, like those are the basic skills that our students need to be successful in any subject, any career, right, moving forward. So I do find so much passion in it because I want our students to be successful and I want them to be readers and writers and
Right.
I want them to be able to do math. And so when we see the scores and we analyze them in my class, it's just like we need to do something about it. And so in New Jersey, we usually do well on these tests, but it's still alarming, and it's only about 50% are on grade level, which is crazy. And why are we finding that acceptable? Is my biggest thing.
I know in Virginia, based on the 2024 results, we didn't do any worse, we didn't do any better. And
Right.
when you look across the state by state, which we're all prone to do, that was considered pretty respectable, that at least, especially after the pandemic, our scores are kind of upheld. But as you said, they're still not where, as educators, proud of what we do with our kids, we'd like them to be. We'd like them to show all the wonderful things that are happening with our students. And so therein lies the rub. Kathleen, welcome. Kathleen McClaskey representing New Hampshire. We have all the states starting with letter N's represented today. Glad to have you all. So, Shantae, what are your thoughts when you hear this? And NAEP in general, in particular, but then in general, when we're talking about end of year assessments.
Well, I think, NAEP and end of year assessments, they have completely different value. Right? NAEP is a matter of national benchmarking,
Yeah.
where your end of year assessments are going to put you closer to your content standards, closer to data that's going to be actionable for you. In North Carolina, our end of year data does still leave us guessing a little.
Mm.
We don't necessarily get very strategic. Strategic's not the word I'm looking for, but we get very high level data around how an individual or a class of students may have performed in different standards. But our bread and butter comes in those formative assessments that we give throughout the year. And most of our districts and schools that I'm aware of do utilize some form of formative, like iReady, Discovery,
IXL.
yeah, IXL.
Mhm.
They're not rolling off my tongue right now.
That's
But we
fine.
know these assessments that we use for benchmarks, sometimes we use them for even in between benchmarks every so many months. Those types of things, common formative
Mhm.
assessments, those types of things. So
Mhm.
when you look at an assessment like NAEP, you know, and when the results came out, especially these last sets of results, right? You have to
Yeah.
look at them with the context too. And as much as we want to act like we have surpassed all of the challenges of COVID, we really haven't. We are
No.
still in recovery mode, right? So just like we had end of year assessments that our students are having to grow and we're having to still show and see progress as
Yeah.
they're catching up, it's going to show up in NAEP, right? They take NAEP, fourth grade, eighth grade, and uh, when did they take it again? Fourth grade, eighth grade, and what?
12?
Fourth grade, eighth grade, and 12th grade,
Yeah.
right? And so you are looking at specific gaps in times before they've even had exposure to this particular assessment. And all standardized assessments are not built the exact same. They may still be standardized, but they're not built the
Right.
exact same.
Yeah.
Other parts of other context here is that when NAEP is administered, it's not administered to all schools, right? When it's administered to segments of the population, and then it'll be administered to another segment, and then it'll come around back again.
Mhm.
So, based on what has happened in context, um, life, edu
Yeah.
we'll know the impact of what's happening with this administration
Yeah.
in several months and years, right? And so all of those taking into account. So when we put up these headlines, right, we have to be really careful about putting them up without appropriate context and
Right.
also putting them up in front of educators and expecting educators to have a very direct response and plan of action around them, knowing that there's so many factors within the context of what has taken place to create the results that are there, right? And so I looked at it and I was like, I'm not surprised, right? The
Yeah.
headlines came out. I am absolutely not surprised, right? It's saying the same thing that end of year assessments have said over time. Our students have to grow out of these challenges. And we can't acknowledge that where we had schools that were served differently and performing differently pre-pandemic, then we still have schools that are being served differently and performing differently post pandemic. And that's going to show up in every test that you administer, until you address and acknowledge the differences and put systems and programs in place that support closing the gaps that those differences cause. So if you're the short answer is I'm not surprised.
Well,
The long
yes.
answer, the long answer is come along and help us, literally help us do something about it.
Thank you. And I put links in the chat box for everyone, just the nation's report card, the state profiles, all the data. Um, so is the key then, Shantae, I'll just ask in my very practical way, which I know practical isn't always the answer. Is it to be doing those bread and butter assessments during the year to make sure they align with what our big picture goals are for students and where we know the gaps are?
Yeah,
Or is it more than
absolutely.
that?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely in the in the bread and butter assessment. If that's what we're gonna call it today. Uh, yeah, that's where we're gonna see the growth. That's where our schools and our teachers are gonna know and understand exactly what our students have learned.
Mhm.
They're gonna be able to look at that and figure out what needs to be addressed, what
Right.
needs to be corrected in their learning misconceptions,
Mhm.
and begin to develop plans from those assessments. And, when we think about it, one of the things that I developed as a teacher and continue to coach on is this development of a formative assessment system,
Yeah.
right? And that does not include NAEP. It
Yeah.
is a system of how we are constantly checking in with our students and our learning. As a math teacher, I gave my students a quiz every single week,
Right.
a quiz every single week, and a test every week and a half, right? Quiz being small bits of information, checking in on how they've gotten progress. And that week and a half, I didn't test them based on a unit. I tested them based on a length of time, because that's exactly what the assessments are doing. When you're talking about benchmarks and you're talking about end of year, yeah, they're cumulative, but this is what you're supposed to have learned in this length of time.
Yeah.
So doing it every week helped me ebb and flow quicker, right? And so it helped me achieve stronger benchmark performance. There was less to fix at each benchmark, right? And then at the end of the year, it helped my students perform at higher levels because we weren't constantly trying to fix something every 3 months. We were fixing learning misconceptions every Wednesday because that's when we quiz, right? And
Yep.
every other, either it either landed like on a Monday or a Friday, right? Balancing it out. And so all of the assessments worked in a system so that we were constantly understanding what students knew, what they didn't know, and developing those plans in real time to address them and not having to take whole instructional blocks to go back and try to fix something and make it feel overwhelming for students and for me as a teacher,
Right.
right? So
Well,
yeah,
and
it's NAEP. When you get those NAEP reports back,
mhm.
you're sitting around something and it's telling you the kids did great or the kids did poorly, but it's not giving you a lot of information to go back and fix it. You're still going to have to go back to what happened in that classroom. How did it impact learning? And how do we move forward? Right. And so it's going to be all of those different checks in between. And if you don't have those,
Mhm.
NAEP is going to feel very heavy.
Right.
If you do, you realize, okay, that's what that looks like. Let me go to the bread and butter
Right.
and really get something going here.
What's interesting is I agree with everything that you said, and it just made me think of I was reading one article from the Learning Policy Institute about NAEP, and they did Stanford and Harvard did a study with the pandemic funding that a lot of schools got, and it said it closed the achievement gap for like low poverty and high paying districts, and it closed the gap between them by a month of instruction because all these schools were now implementing different instructional programs to help students with their learning. And so when you're talking about formative assessments and like correcting those issues, I think a lot of students were getting those instructional moments with teachers during those programs that were implemented after the pandemic. And I mean, I saw it in my school too. We did different reading and math extra help programs, and students were getting better. And now funding in New Jersey, at least, is going away for COVID. And now schools are left scrambling, and all these programs are now going away again.
Yeah, yeah, that is the challenge, right? Like, how do we continue to make something happen
Mhm.
when we have lost the funding? If your partnerships were connected to the funding, right, and you don't have in-kind partners and folks that are willing to donate, and this is in the economic climate is different now,
Oh yeah,
Totally.
right? And so folks are having to be very thoughtful about where they are placing their dollars, and not just that education is not a worthy cause to do it, but even having to scrutinize so many different aspects of an educational program
right.
before they can even determine whether they're eligible to try to support something totally different, right? So, money matters.
Hmm.
Money
Absolutely.
matters. The funding matters, in order to be able to do these things. And it is a significant factor. And we've known this for years, ever since we've been talking about achievement gaps,
Sure.
Hmm.
that how we program and how we fund, how we staff, all of those factors impact achievement gaps. So when we have these money, and we got a lot of that money during the pandemic with
We did.
very little direction
Yep.
and very little oversight, which created a great deal of opportunity, but did it necessarily create the opportunity to close achievement gaps, right? Folks had to decide, how are we going to use this? And it may have been for physical safety, right? It may have
Right.
been for social well-being.
Yeah.
And then on the academic side, there was a plethora of different ways that it could have been impactful.
Yeah.
But there's also, and that may not have been in alignment with closing an achievement gap versus closing a different gap within
Right.
schools.
Totally. I agree with that.
It's really fair. And I know when you started sharing your thoughts with us, Shantae, you said you weren't sure strategic was the word you wanted to use. What I'm getting from what this discussion is saying is instead of being reactive and waiting till you get your NAEP scores and then wondering what it all means and feeling like it's a huge lift, having things in place, having programs and processes and strategies in place, things you can control. You can't control what's happening in Washington right now. You may not be even able to control your school board's budget discussions at this point with everything coming down. But if you're able to equip yourself with an understanding of the bread and butter all year work that you do with your kids, and then practice this as you so nicely described it. I mean, it sounds very doable. Every Wednesday, having things in place and not just jumping at it once and then waiting 3 months and then coming back to it thinking, oh, they still don't have it. What am I going to do? A lot of it is just not being reactive. And again, and then I'll be quiet. Now's the time of year to start thinking about this. June's coming, but you want to be ready for next year as well. And so having this conversation now and in hearing your very practical ideas is so on point for what everyone should be thinking about when it comes to assessment in general, and then how aligned am I in what I'm doing in the classroom with what NAEP ultimately measures and reports every couple of years.
Yeah, you really have to decide what is the value innate for you, your district, or what have you. As a former director of accountability who did testing
Mhm.
for a district, I can tell you we administered it because we had to,
Right.
right? And that was the deal. I can tell you that we held a lot of conversation about it,
Yeah.
because our end of year assessments gave us more information. That's
Yeah.
what we were reacting to. That's where our school performance grades came from. That's where our student growth came from. um, show. And, that's where our teachers began to look to see how they wanted to address students for next year, right? Based on how they came out the year before on that standardized assessment.
Sure.
So, I think you just have to, and maybe that varies from state to state and whatever the climate is in your state. And that's what you just have to be very thoughtful about what the value is of that assessment or any assessment, right? Because you can be data rich and analysis poor. You can be data
Amen.
rich and strategy poor, right? And that's not going to help anybody.
No.
So
Well, and on that same point, and back to Samantha's point, if you have your own data and your own program in place and you know what you value, whether you're talking to community stakeholders or potential funders, you can make a much more solid case about the work you're doing, how well you know your students and what they need, and how proactive you're being, so that when you're asking for either community support or funding support or anyone else, you can say, we got our act together. It's not a matter of we're sitting here wondering which end is up, but these are tough times and we need your support.
I also
Kat,
think, oh, sorry, Walter,
no,
based on this
please.
conversation, like it doesn't matter if it's NAEP or state testing or even just a summative test, it's all about strong instructional practices in the classroom to
Thank you.
help our students as well. Right? Like something as simple as creating a formative assessment schedule, like Shantae is saying. I think some teachers get lost in like the big picture stuff and like the kids doing well that sometimes they lose sight and they forget to just set up something so simple and so like easy that's going to help students and then themselves as a teacher, right? If you know every Wednesday you're giving a quiz, right? That takes the guesswork out of planning, right? And it sets everyone up for great expectations and doing well.
It's so true. We don't want the tail wagging the dog.
no,
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's all about instruction. Kathleen, what does this sound like in New Hampshire these days? Are they talking about assessment? I know there's so much else going on. It may not be top of mind, but what do the scores look like in New Hampshire? And as a longtime education practitioner, what conversations are you having with people? Oh, and you're on mute, so please, yeah. We still can't hear you, Kathleen. We can't hear you. Yeah. There you go.
It's good to put on the audio, right?
There you go.
There you are. So I haven't really looked at really the scores here in New Hampshire, and how it really goes here is that because we're so locally controlled, there are obviously communities that actually are able to provide more funding for different programs than and it's really, there's, a lot of inequity here in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And because we have, property poor communities and property rich communities, and wherever you live determines really what type of education you get here in the state. So I haven't really looked at the scores at all, but I was looking at the NAEP scores, just the state profiles here. And it seems like New Hampshire does fairly well. We have very small communities here. I live in a community of 11,000 people, so we have a lot of bedroom communities, and people are involved in education and in these very small communities. But if you're in a poorer town, you don't get the same funding
Right.
because it's based on property. Okay.
Yep.
And that's really the inequity here we have in New Hampshire, which is really not good. But I'm sure that this is the inequity that we have even across the country.
Yes.
And,
Based on
one of
zip
the
code.
big things is really to have some sort of, what type of assessments, go on a day-by-day basis, What about self-assessment? Does that contribute to better scores? If kids really know how to self-assess, right? I've been sort of removed from standardized testing, and personally, I never did well on standardized tests, although my grades never reflected that
Right.
in my schoolwork, right?
Yeah.
And that some kids just don't take
No.
good standardized tests. I
No.
don't think they're really a determining factor. And I know there's so many changes here in the Department of Education. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if actually standardized tests are actually going to continue. I'd be really interested to, to
Yeah.
hear from these ladies what they see. Is this going to continue in your state um, or, or not? So,
Yeah. Well, I know there was a news item just out 2 days ago
yeah,
because I saw it and I shared and commented on it that some of the higher level NAEP tests, the secondary tests, are being discontinued
yeah,
just as a matter of budget cutting and
yeah,
the money's not going to be there.
right,
They're still committed to doing the fourth and eighth grade at this point, but they're looking for even deeper cuts than they've already taken. So who knows where that goes. Shante and Samantha, can you comment on that from North Carolina and New Jersey in terms of the zip code lottery for what kind of education you get
yeah,
and
right,
how we think about that as educators?
The zip code lottery in terms of the funding.
yeah,
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and it is the same, right? Like
Yep. Yep.
if you are in a more affluent area,
right,
then
yeah,
the cost of education per pupil is higher, and that, plays out in the funding aspect of it, right?
right,
You get
right,
more per student, and you
right,
have more to work with
Yeah.
in that space. And sometimes you have spaces that are so large, you still have more per student. But you are looking at, how are those resources being dispersed
Yep.
in the various
mhm,
locations, right?
right,
Um, when you're looking at individual schools within
right,
a particular um, district, right? And I think, Kathleen, you raised a great point of, what is the future of standardized testing, right?
right. What is
And
the
that's
future?
a great question but I think it leads us to another aspect of, standardized testing at its core should be providing us information not around how well students are doing and how we can support them to ensure that we are leveling the playing field. One of the biggest issues with standardized testing right now is the way it's being weaponized.
Mm,
The way it's being weaponized against educators, the way
right,
it's being weaponized against students.
right,
You literally have students who are going into schools with anxiety over how they may perform on these assessments. And not that they play into their grades, but what these assessments might speak about them and how they are being used to impact students' futures,
right,
right? And so that's the challenge around standardized testing. If we were looking at standardized testing at its core, it would tell us how different races of students were performing, and we would be using that to understand how we can support those different races of students so that we're leveling the playing field for them in education. If we were using standardized testing at its core, it would tell us how students with different disabilities are performing, and we
right,
would be using that information to level the playing field for students, no matter what their disabilities are.
right,
But when we are getting these headlines and we're getting these other conversations, um, then we have lost the focus of what standardized testing should be in place to be able in the way standardized testing should be in place to support students, and we have turned it into a beast that has become more harmful than it is good. And
mm,
that's the power of having that assessment system in your room, because
right,
you will always be able to advocate for your students based on what they know and what
right.
they don't know, because you know exactly what you gave them.
Amen. So well said. And, to that point, Rose Chu in Minneapolis, you could wave as you fly out tonight, Shantae, is doing great work across the state there on taking back the narrative on this and saying, we are the ones doing the work. We need to help redirect this narrative back to what's the value of a child's future? What's the value of a teacher working with that child to help them? That's the work. And the more it gets politicized and the more people are polarized, the harder it is for us to be able to do the work in our classrooms. It's an amazing job she's doing. She's going to be in our next in our summer journal talking about it because she's been at it long enough now that she's starting to get qualitative and quantitative data to back up what she's saying. But we all have a stake in that because who can better speak for our children than those of us that are with them all day? And as Shantae is saying, if you really know, if you really have the data, you can speak passionately and convincingly that this is where we are. And especially children with special needs. This is how we can make those success stories. No one should be saying in 2025, some children just can't learn. That shouldn't even be in the narrative anymore.
No.
Get off my soapbox now. So,
Yeah, I think about kids with special needs because that's been a big focus of my life.
yes,
Children that had a variety of challenges, and so I think about kids with special needs. But you know, I have a quote saying, remove the veil of disability, and you'll see the learner.
wow.
Okay, okay, and
Thank you.
I believe in that deeply. So.
It's so true.
Because I think that what happens, so I spent a good part of the last 25 years getting people to focus on the learner,
Yeah.
and each individual learner
Yes.
instead of the disability or the challenge that child has, because each one of us has a certain level of challenges. Even those kids that are doing academically well, often have challenges that they often don't discuss. So, as I said, I did horrible on standardized tests. I remember taking my SATs and it was like, wow,
Yeah.
here I am in the top 10 of my class and
Yeah.
I can't even take SATs, right?
Yeah.
So that was always rather disappointing, but those are the things that in the end actually didn't really impact me for the long
Yeah.
term,
Yeah.
So
Thank goodness. Thank goodness.
yeah. So
So Samantha is someone working with future teachers, and
Mhm.
Shantae is someone who gets in there with school districts and develops strategies. If I'm a teacher listening tonight, where do I start? If I feel like I've been trying to figure it out the best I can in my own classroom and I may not have the supports right there with me yet, how do you suggest educators start to put these things in place and do their own professional learning on a classroom scale? Where do you start?
Shantae, do you want to go first?
Easy question.
No,
Yeah,
definitely easy a question.
softball. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Walter, you know me well enough to know my story, right?
Yes.
And so I share in different spaces. One of the ways Walter and I, um short version, we met on the ASCD side of things.
Yeah.
And I got there looking for development.
Yeah.
And where, everybody's just kind of taking it, you're doing this, you're rocking and rolling, but you still want to grow, right? And so I needed to find spaces, even if I had to invest in myself, right? Put my own money on the table, gone were the days where districts were paying and sending people off
Yeah.
places to develop. And Walter can tell you, I got to a point where I was trying to negotiate price for me and other people,
Yeah.
right? So
Hey,
we could get there.
work it.
And I put that in context to say I had to find what felt comfortable and right for me in my development.
Yeah.
And that's something that I would say for any teacher, new, veteran, when you have, right, every day at the center of this are children and they're learning. But when you're talking about children and learning, you're talking about their lives, right?
Mhm.
They're going on to live into spaces and they have to be prepared for this.
Yeah.
Right. And that's our ultimate responsibility. No matter what NAEP says, no matter what anything else, ultimately their time with us is development and preparation.
Yeah.
And so when if I'm finding myself under-resourced, if I'm finding myself needing to serve kids with out, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, support,
Yeah.
right, then I am going to find it, right? I'm going to attach myself to a worthy educator, right, who that's offering conversations like this, where
Yeah.
I might be able to find some avenues, some strategies. And now we get a lot of stuff for free because everything it might be virtual and free,
Right.
right? It wasn't always that way. But it's figuring out what piece is not comfortable, what piece is not working. And a lot of times we're professionals. We know before somebody else tells us.
Right.
It might sting when they do, but we know when they tell us, and pursue my growth in that area. So what does it look like when we're supporting kids, right? So there's some things we've heard on this call today. Like, what
Yes.
is formative assessment, right? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Okay, formative versus summative assessment.
Yeah.
Okay. What are some other things that we've heard since we've been on this town? I talked about assessment systems, right? What is an assessment rhythm for me and my students? And who are some folks who are implementing that well? We talked about, in several instances, I led with both PLC questions, right? What are students learning? What have they not learned? How are we going to fix it? Right. And all of those are rooted in the PLC, the
Yeah.
4 questions, right, for
Right.
PLCs.
Right.
And so identifying these places where I know I need to be a stronger support for my students and finding my point of access, right? And it may not be the $1,000 conference. It may be the free webinar. And I can tell you one thing, for me as a first, second, and third year teacher, it was my colleagues next door.
Yeah.
Right. It was holding conversations. It was, how are you using this particular tool? My call and response right now is the same one I started with 20 something years ago.
Yeah.
That the teacher across the hall shared with me, my attention signal. A teacher across the hall shared with me. I used it with my kids, and now I use it doing PDs for superintendent. It still works, and it was all free. It was just great advice, right? So
Love that.
figuring out where your gap is in terms of pursuing this excellence for your students and pursuing that growth opportunity. You don't know how many times I've emailed somebody that I saw at a conference. I was in their presentation and I've asked them for mentorship, not because they were down the street from me, because I am watching what you are doing and I want to be able to pursue that. And just opening that door created a door for me to be able to email and say, I'm having this challenge. I am, or I want to pursue this. Do you have guidance for me? We may have taken 5 years for us to see each other at a conference somewhere, but there was still growth in the relationship.
So
I hope I answered.
it does. Advocating for ourselves.
Yeah.
You shouldn't hide in your classroom afraid to go next door and say, I'm struggling with this, or I don't know the answer to this, and start sharing and making it a safe place to have those conversations. Because the fact that these things get published and people are comparing can make educators feel like they have to hunker down and keep their head down. But the reality is, what I'm hearing you say loud and clear is, no, you got to get out there. You need to find the people that you want to emulate and will give you answers and then pursue them. I mean, out of all those times, Shantae, and I know the answer, but I'll ask anyway, for all those times that you reached out to someone after you saw their presentation or heard of the work they were doing, how many times did someone tell you, no, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm not going to help you?
I I can't think of any time that
No,
anyone
thank you.
said no,
Right.
right? Um,
We're all in this together.
we are all in this together. And when you have that heart of student learning and
Right.
connecting it to student lives,
Yes.
like there's not anybody that's doing this work that doesn't want to see you champion this thing,
Amen.
right? So it's really go get it, right?
Yep.
And one of the blessings of now versus 5 years ago is that we are trying so hard not to grind so much that folks are seeing you,
Right.
right? And so they can give you wise counsel in terms of your strategy and what you produce, but also what that means for you physically and emotionally for what you're putting on the table in order to get there and lead you not to what I call balance, but I have a friend who calls it acceptance, right? And
Mhm.
leads you to what is your acceptance, right? And so it's, yeah,
Yeah.
I can't recall a time that anyone
No.
did not respond to the email
Yeah.
or yeah, or any of that.
Yeah. Vivian in the chat box, most of the time when experts are asked to help, they can't wait because folks who are passionate about something usually want to share what they're passionate about. She loves what you're saying, Shantae.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is true, Vivian. I have had that experience, and for that reason, I have some of the best mentors
Yeah.
ever.
Samantha, what are your thoughts?
I think any worthy educator leader that you have, or anybody from even ASCD emerging leader that I came in contact with,
Yeah.
was always willing. And I did the same thing, Shantae. I reached out to different people that like I wanted to like learn more about, or I had questions. Like they were like, here's my calendar. And I signed up to Zoom with them. And in my head, the first time I did it, I was like, oh my God, like I don't have any money to pay them.
Right.
Like But then like once we got on, I was like, what was I thinking? Like it was amazing. And like they just want to talk and they just want to help you. And it's not like they're trying to get ahead thing. Like they really do like want to make you better and just help you. And I
This
think
wasn't, go
making the
ahead.
time for that is so important.
It is. And over the years with the Emerging Leaders Program, we spent a lot of time early on kind of banging our head against a wall trying to do mentoring pairs where you would hope you could align two people together, a veteran and a new emerging leader, and let them work together and learn together. But what we finally found out or figured out, when our heads stopped hurting from banging our head so much, was if we brought people together in groups and had certain people coach a group of emerging leaders, the dynamic and the ability to exchange and support and feel like you were part of something bigger was so much more powerful.
Mhm.
And guess who was one of those coaches? Guess who was one of those wonderful people that I called on and said, I know you already wear 75 different hats and you don't have any more hours in your day, but would you be willing once a month to get online with our emerging leaders and just help? Shantae. And she said yes. She was right there, and people ate it up. They just loved having you there for them. And I can't thank you enough publicly,
Well,
Shantae.
no worries. And I had a blast
Yeah,
and I met some of the most amazing
yeah,
leaders and people
yes,
that and to that point I can
yeah,
still email them,
yep,
right?
exactly.
And try to email and say, hey, did you see this or did you take a look at this? Or just checking in, right?
Yes,
Because
yes,
that's just what we do, right? I don't
yep.
want to be out here serving people all over the country and in other countries and that kind of thing, and then leaving other spaces behind.
We're so grateful for that. Thank you. And I I say this all the time, and it sounds like it should be in italics on a plaque somewhere, and it probably is, but it's all about the relationships.
Mhm.
The more each of us reaches out and embraces others and give when we can and take when we need and have that community where we all know each other, that's what's going to make us or break us. And I worry sometimes coming out of the pandemic if we lost some of that sense, It seemed like in the 20 teens there was a lot more going on online in terms of collaboration, and people have gotten kind of overwhelmed, and maybe it isn't quite as vibrant as it was. But I think you're all saying loud and clear, we need each other, and we need to get out there and put ourselves out there to get what we need, but also to be there for others.
And I think on that end, we need to do that in our schools too. Like we need to foster relationships, and it's all about that before the test scores,
Yeah.
right? If our students don't feel seen and heard in our classrooms, yeah, they're not going to do well on these tests, and they're not going to be totally ready to learn from us. And we're with these students 8 hours, 10 hours a day sometimes. And so if that relationship's not there in the school system, you know, there in itself, I feel like we're failing our students.
Mhm.
It's so true. Kathleen, thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, so it's all about relationships for sure.
Yeah.
And building relationships with children and positive relationships with children in your classroom is absolutely key to being really an effective teacher. And when children know that you care about them and you see them and value them, they'll do just about anything, right? And that's, I think, really important is that you build a community in a classroom. I know this was talking about assessments during this time, but I think that, being a former teacher and administrator, I always, thought about the importance of valuing every child in the classroom.
Yeah.
So I spent my whole career doing this and still do it. So above and beyond assessments, I think it's important for kids to be able to be, really good self-assessors, how
You had
to,
mentioned that. Yeah.
yeah. So self-assessment is really important. And of course, I'll say that self-advocacy is another.
Yeah.
And getting kids to be able to open up and to self-advocate for what they need.
Yeah.
And creating that environment and that culture in your classroom, I think is key. And I know, again, we're talking about assessments, but in the end, it is about relationships and it's
Yeah.
about kids feeling valued and be able to self-advocate for who they are and how they learn. And so they
Thank
can
you.
asking those things, and asking each other, I reflect just
Exactly.
upon my own education when we had 35 kids in a classroom
Right.
that we did a lot of tutoring each other.
Yes.
We're always teaching each other in the
Yes.
classroom.
Yeah.
And that's how teachers, they didn't have any aides. They just had one teacher and 35 kids. And so what'd you do?
Right. Right.
About that a lot, and what it was is that we created a community
Right.
and we cared about each other.
Yeah.
We helped each other. So that's key. I mean,
It is. It really
um,
is.
because kids actually do learn a lot from each other.
They do. They do. When
Right?
I
Really effective instructional strategies is absolutely key for teachers. To be able to teach all learners has always been a challenge, but knowing who those children are and how they learn is probably the bottom line in order to be effective in the classroom.
yeah. When I hear self-awareness, I think of things back from my formative years like metacognition, thinking about thinking. Is that
Yeah.
still where this is when we're thinking about this today? Are, is that considered like the hidden curriculum, or are we deliberately teaching metacognition to be self-aware and advocating for ourselves as students? What are you seeing in schools?
Yeah.
Anybody?
I think like in New Jersey, we're teaching a lot of those skills. We introduced, career ready practices, and we're trying to teach kids on like being self-aware, reflecting, professionalism, and having conversations and deliberate lessons about those items.
Yeah.
Um, which I think is good and has been helpful, but I think there's could a lot more work that could be done with it.
Mhm.
And I think, and to your point, so I just did a professional development in a district 2 weeks ago. And metacognition was one of the focal points of
Ah,
that
okay.
professional development. And it wasn't done in the under the lens of self-awareness, but it was done under the lens of developing critical thinkers. And
Yes.
so as part of this professional development, it is making sure, one, that the teachers understand what metacognition is, and two, that we understand how to model it, right? And then if we know what it is and we know how to model it, how to incorporate that model into our lessons, no matter what our content is, every single day, and describing it as students building that muscle, right? We continue to build the muscle of thinking critically, right? And so, in the spirit of this conversation, then a student who is able to think critically is able to pull in multiple perspectives and begin to analyze situations, which is going to strengthen their ability to understand their internal needs, how they're experiencing the world, and how they are using information to support themselves in the world, right? They don't have to sit back in silence because they have the processing ability, and they have access to the language that they need in order to express how they are seeing the world differently.
Yes.
And that's a different point of advocacy, and also a means of self-awareness in that space. And I say this to encourage any of our leaders and teachers there. And so when I say a couple of weeks ago, right, all of us are in the home stretch of the year, right? May is this week.
Yep.
And June will be around the corner. But yet it was still important that we hold that professional development, knowing that this year is ending. Why? Because learning doesn't stop at the end of the year, right? These students will still be returning at the beginning of the next school year. So when we are thinking about developing teachers, developing students, yeah, you have summer slide, but you still have to start at some point.
Yeah.
Right. And so as we are thinking and we're holding conversation, and back to your point, Walter, for somebody who's trying to figure out, where do I begin, right? If we find the error or something, let's go ahead and reset it, right? Let's go ahead and reset it and move it forward. And that's exactly what we were doing in that professional development. The timing didn't matter. Student learning and student lives matter.
Thank you. And what a point to hone in on. Is there anything else that we haven't covered in this discussion that we should say at this point? We have about 7 minutes left, and I don't want to end it without giving everybody a chance. If there was something else that needed to be said, that needs to be heard on the whole subject of NAEP and assessment and advocating for ourselves and for our students. I know we've covered a lot to think about. I do want to say, and I've put it in the chat box, as we've been talking, 2 weeks from this Saturday, Shantae is holding an incubator for us on May 17th at 11 a.m. Reset. And this is a methodology that she has created herself and has trademarked. This is her own methodology, 5 steps to data-driven excellence. And so if this has piqued your interest and you're thinking, what are next steps? How do I drill down deeper into this? Please join us. We'd love to have you. And Shantae is the real deal. So what you received here tonight is just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg of just a wealth of information and wisdom and practical applications that she will share. So
Oh,
please
I
join us.
appreciate that. Yeah. And
Yeah.
we would love to have you.
Yes.
Anybody that's working with me would tell you I'm the queen of a reset. And so like, we can listen, because that's the only way you're gonna get there. You can't get defeated, right? You
No.
can't just switch strategies over and over. You got to have a process to be able to analyze those strategies, see if we're working, see if we're pulling them through. How are we gonna pivot? Those types of things. And so we'll be talking about all of that in the reset. reset and thinking about, yeah, some of us have more year left than others, right? There might be some things we can reset now, but we have a whole new school year coming that we can get prepared for. So I'm
Yep.
excited.
Well, we're thrilled to have you doing that for us and
Well,
providing the opportunity to everyone. So thank you. Samantha, any last words? Samantha, I didn't say at the top of the hour, Samantha was the one that came and said, we should talk about NAEP. We should talk about this. This needs to be a town hall. So thank you.
okay.
Any final closing thoughts on your end?
I think if you replace NAEP with your state standardized tests, or if your district does its own testing, whatever you want to call it, I think
Mhm.
any of our strategies will work for just great teaching and helping our students, no matter what it is.
Thank you. And Kathleen, anything to kind of top it all off, the cherry
Oh,
on top of the sundae? Oh, did she freeze up on us?
Oh no.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
I
think she's
jinxed her.
frozen on my end.
Sorry, Kathleen. Well, I want to thank you. Um, this has been a fruitful discussion. We'll get the recording done and get it out to that many more people. And again, looking forward to, well, in the future, I guess I should say this before we sign off. In addition to Shantae's incubator coming up in a little more than 2 weeks, we do have town halls coming in May, two of them. The first is on Tuesday, May 13th, on advocating as professional educators, and then May 27th on local advocacy that gets results. And I think, if we say nothing else before we sign off, this is exactly what Shantae personifies, which is the best advocacy is to do the work. The best advocacy is to show that you are on top of it and you are the advocate for your kids and you have the data to back it up. So, Shantae and Samantha, thank you so much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for having us.